Good evening. Certainly good to be able to stand before you again as we continue, as I've been doing for a couple years now, actually I think about 3 years now, on Wednesday evenings when I have the devotional. We've been working our way through the book of Psalms, and tonight we're going to look at Psalm 78, probably I think the largest psalm that we have looked at to this point, but that's okay. We need to build our stamina before we get to Psalm 119. And so the kids were asking me and laughing, like, Dad, are you going to read the entirety of Psalm 78? I thought about it, and I did read it a couple times this afternoon, but we will not read the entirety of Psalm 78 this evening. But we are going to do things maybe a little bit differently than we have some of the other Psalms. And so as we consider Psalm 78, and you still do have Psalm 78 on your handout, and so I would encourage you to go home and on your own time read Psalm 78. You'll be glad that you did. The title of this particular parable, the title that I have, and this title's not original to me, I don't remember where I got it, but a parable of a faithless nation. The whole theme within the psalm is the disobedience of Israel, even in light of God's generous provisions. And what you see throughout the psalm, what the psalmist is really going to do is almost give a brief history lesson, if you will. As a matter of fact, if you let your eyes go down to the section on your handout that's marked a textual outline, you'll notice that it deals with Ephraim's unfaithfulness, verses 9 to 11. How Israel was unfaithful during the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings, verses 12 through 31. How Israel continued in unbelief, verses 32 to 39. How Israel's unbelief in light of God's mighty works in Egypt, verses 40 to 53. How Israel was unfaithful even after leaving Egypt and receiving the promised land, verses 54 to 64, and yet despite all of that, as God was caring for them, even in their complaining and their murmuring and their unfaithfulness, the last section there, verses 65 to 72, God fulfilled His promise in regard to David and his kingdom. And so, as you can see there, the writer is Asaph, and we're in a section of various psalms that were written by Asaph. The date and occasion, again, commentators are split on when this particular psalm was written. And so the one that I found most likely was possibly when the tabernacle was moved from Shiloh to Judah, but again, there's not really any way to be sure of that. So what we want to do then is we do want to look at some of the various lessons that are learned within this particular psalm. And so since we're not going to read the entire psalm, I do want to read verses 1 through 8, because as you see on the textual outline, that is the whole purpose for this particular psalm. So note Psalm 78 there in verse number 1. It says, "Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, showing to the generations to come the praises of the Lord and His strength and His wonderful works that He hath done. For He established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to their children, that they might set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments, and might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that set not their hearts aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with God." Verse number 8. So what the psalmist does before he gets into this history lesson, he pleads with them in verse number 1. Incline your ears to listen to the law of God. And so the first thing that he commands the people to do, which is a great lesson for me and you, is we need to listen to the law of God. We need to make sure. Now, when we talk about listening to the law of God, I think we all understand that it's more than just hearing the audible words of the law of God. But it's taking those things and applying them to our lives. Several times throughout the book of Revelation, what you have Jesus doing, a matter of fact, I think in Revelation chapter number 2 and in Revelation chapter number 3, at the end of each address to the 7 churches of Asia, you'll find a verse where Jesus says, "He that has ears to hear, let them hear." What's the point that Jesus is making? Is he wanting those 7 churches of Asia to just hear the audible words? No, Jesus is wanting them to take the law and apply it to their life. So that's what the psalmist is doing in this particular psalm. Now, one of the things that is then essential to what the psalmist is trying to do is the idea that they teach. How many times do you see in verse number 6, in verse number 7, in verse number 8, that the purpose of this parable, the purpose of God's law, is to be taken, is to be taught to the children. That way when they arise, they are not stubborn as their fathers were. You think about the book of Judges, Judges chapter number 2 and verse number 10. There arose a generation in Israel which knew not God, nor the works which he had done in Israel. Question, and you know the answer. How could a generation arise that did not know God? Because the parents did not teach. That's how a generation arises that doesn't know God. When you look at the Church of Christ, why is it that it seems like some generations of the Lord's church are really, really strong, and then another generation is really, really weak? Now, it's not all of this, but part of it is because teaching is not occurring. And when I say teaching is not occurring, oftentimes it has to deal with teaching in the home is not occurring. Sometimes if we're not careful, we've tricked ourselves into thinking that my children get enough about God Sunday morning worship, Sunday morning Bible study, and Sunday evening worship, and Wednesday night Bible study. And don't misunderstand me, I'm glad that you're here this evening. And I am super excited when I see you on a Sunday morning and a Sunday evening. But understand, there has to be more to your Christianity than what goes on in these buildings. Another lesson that can be learned that really when you take from the entire psalm, right? You think about Romans chapter number 15 and verse number 4. There Paul would write to the church at Rome, those things that are written aforetime are written for our learning. We have a great example. The psalmist, still in the Old Testament, is pulling from information further back in the Old Testament. And what's the purpose of him pulling that information? To teach, for learning. You and I have the benefit that we have the entirety of the Old Testament, and we should take these things and we should learn them and we should teach others also. You know, being faithful to God is not a one-time thing. It's not a one-day thing. If we're going to be faithful to God, it is something that we must strive to do each and every day. Let it be never said about us that we were not faithful each and every day. Now I understand that sometimes, even as God's people, that we're going to sin. We're going to miss that mark. But part of being faithful is when you do miss that mark, what do? You know, it's the old adage, right? When you fall down, do you stay down? No. You got to get back up. As a Christian, as we're living this Christian life, as we're running this Christian race, as Paul would talk about in 1 Corinthians chapter number 9, verses 24, all the way down to the end of the chapter, as we're running that Christian race, what are we doing when we come across hardships? What are we doing when we run across trials? Are we letting those things get the better of us? Or are we leaning on the lessons that we can be learned? You know, a few other lessons that I think are important that we can learn even from this psalm. Look at verse number 31. Psalm 78, verse number 31, the wrath of God came upon them and slew the fatness of them and smote down the chosen men of Israel. For all this they sinned still and believed not for his wondrous works. What did God do? And I know for those that are in the Wednesday night adult Bible class, we just got discussing similar things. But what happened when people sinned? God slew them. If you get nothing else from our time together this evening, get this: God does not play around with sin. You ever known those parents? That little Jimmy over here is doing something. I promised John and Janice that I would no longer say little Johnny. So you got little Jimmy over here, and he's just doing something, and Mom will say, "Don't do that." And then little Jimmy continues on, "Don't do that." And then little Jimmy continues on, and they just let Jimmy go on and be a pain. See, God doesn't do that. God is very serious about sin. He takes care of it. Now again, as we made mention in our Wednesday night class upstairs, we're in a situation now where God is not ignoring sin, God is not overlooking sin, but He is long-suffering, as Peter brings out in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse number 9. But there's a time coming when that long-suffering of God is going to come to an end. And He's going to deal with man's sin. You know, the saddest thing, as I was reading through this psalm that I came across, one of the saddest sections of Scripture was, note verses 35 to 39. And this can really sum up the history of Israel and their relationship with God. And to me, it's sad. Look at verse 39. And they remembered that God was their rock, and the high God their Redeemer. Well, that seems encouraging. They remembered God. They remembered who God was. Verse 36. Nevertheless, they did flatter him with their mouth, and they lied unto him with their tongues. For their heart was not right with him, neither were they steadfast in his covenant. But he, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity, and destroyed them not. Yea, many a time turned he his anger away, and did not stir up all his wrath. For he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passeth away and cometh not again. So to me, that's one of the saddest things about Israel's relationship with God. God would bless them, they would turn away from God, and yet what would God do? You know, there's a chapter in the book of Ezekiel, and I didn't add this to the handout, so I don't have the notes in front of me, but if you ask me after class, I'll tell you exactly what chapter it is, because I'll look it up in my notes. But there's a chapter where Ezekiel does the same thing with the children of Israel that the psalmist is doing. And he goes through a history lesson with Israel. And he says, and God did not destroy the people, not for their sake, but for his own name's sake. It's kind of similar with Moses, right? Remember when the people were worshiping that golden calf in Exodus chapter 32? And you know, Moses is coming down the mountain, and God says, you know what, Moses, just stand aside. I'm going to kill all of them, and I'm just going to start over with you. You know, Moses interceded on the people, and he said, God, don't do it for your name's sake. And so what's the point of all this? The last lesson on your lesson learned, I think, is a big lesson that we should take away, and where I want to end our time together this evening. But it's simply this: we should always remember that covenant that we have with God. This covenant, you can see it in the patriarchal age, you can see it under the law of Moses, and you can see it under the law of Christ. God says, I will be your God if you will be my people. God says, I will be the greatest God that you could ever imagine. And they imagined a bunch of little gods. I mean, that's what Paul said in Acts chapter number 17, right? I noticed the gods of your religion. He said, you were so religious that you even had a God over here that said to the unknown God. Jehovah says, I can be better than all of that. I can care for you better than anything that you can come up with. I can bless you beyond imagine. If. Small little word, but big meaning. If you will be my people. So my encouragement to you this evening, will you be God's people. Don't be like Israel here. Truly be God's people. Do what he desires you to do this very evening. Maybe you're here and you're not one of his people. Why not choose this very evening to become one of his people? Maybe you're here this evening and you're one of his children, but maybe you've wandered away. Maybe you're not behaving as the child of God that you are. Why not choose tonight to make that right? If you're here this evening and you're subject to the Lord's invitation, we encourage you to come. Together we stand and we sing.